Hello, you guys. I'm going to read us Evelyn Underhill, her book called Mysticism, the nature and development of studying the nature and development of spiritual consciousness. All right. So I'm going to walk now so we get the sunset. But I will be showing you the sunset as I read. Anyway, much love. See you in a second. Okay. Hello. All right. I'm going to be reading Mysticism. I may get to show an earlier sunset at some part of this video. And we're reading Evelyn Underhill's book from 1910. It's the study of the nature and spiritual of the development of spiritual consciousness. You can read about it in the description. It's an amazing book on mysticism. We're going through it because I didn't see it anywhere else online, and I like listening to books, so I was gonna just read this, and then I thought I'd give it to us, right? Hopefully these connect. There. Okay. All right, here we go. We're a few chapters out of, a few pages out of this one, the next chapter. I'll tell you what the next chapter is. I was going to finish it last time, but it was just getting so late. Mysticism and Theology is chapter 5, so that's coming right up. And she has this big paragraph right here. I'll show you. Well, I'll show you now if you want something else to look at. You can take a screenshot. I don't know if this can play at the same time, but it's a free copyright book. So I have the link if you want to read along. I guess what would be the point? Because someone's reading to you, right? I can't pull the rock any closer to sit in a better place. Okay. We were on 108. So too, there are two distinct sides. C.S. Lewis was inspired by, and they corresponded with Evelyn Underhill, and Tolkien and Charles Williams wrote, wow, this smells really good, wrote the preface to a bunch of her books. And he was part of the Inklings, which is the group that C.S. Lewis was in, and Tolkien in Oxford. All right, they met at the Eagle and Child, this great pub that's been there since like the 1500s and has like a tunnel underneath. I don't know if they tell that part anymore, but okay. So too, there are two distinct sides to the full mystical experience. A, the vision or consciousness of absolute perfection. B, the inward transmutation to which the vision compels the mystic in order that he may be to some extent worthy of that which he has beheld, may take his place within the order of reality with a capital R. So she uses he a lot. It's just like mankind, there's humankind, and then there's a female version and the male version. That's how I've heard it explained by someone else. And so he is like just representing humankind. It's not meant to cut out all the she's, because there's a she that's writing this. She's amazing. Anyway, so sometimes I'll just switch it out for she, but sometimes I'll just keep reading he. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna read that part over again because it's so good. And she goes so deep in this, but I haven't read ahead. So too, there are two distinct sides to the full mystical experience. A, the vision or consciousness of absolute perfection. Those are both capitalized, so it's like God, the absolute. B, the inward transmutation to which that vision compels the mystic in order that he may be to some extent worthy of that which he has beheld, may take his place within the order of reality. He has seen the perfect. He wants to be perfect too. The, quote, third term, the necessary bridge between the absolute and the self, can only, he feels, be moral and spiritual transcendence, in a word, sanctity. For The only means of attaining the absolute lies in adapting ourselves to it. This is why Teresa of Avila says that prayer and virtue must go together. It's not someone pretending to be virtuous. It's you get a glimpse of the divine. You get this oneness, and you want to let the divine love burn away everything that gets in between you and divine love, you and God. You gladly let go of it because you see that nothing compares. Nothing compares to God, to divine love. The moral virtues are for him, then, the obligatory ornaments of the spiritual marriage. That's a quote, ornaments of the spiritual marriage, as Ruysbroeck called them. Though far more than their presence is needed to bring that marriage about. You can't just, like I said, act virtuous. Unless this impulse for moral perfection be born in him, this travail of the inner life begun, he is no mystic, though he may well be a visionary, a prophet, a mystical poet, a quote, mystical poet. Moreover, this process of transmutation, this rebuilding of the self on higher levels, will involve the establishment within the field of consciousness, the making central for life of those subconscious spiritual perceptions, which are the primary material of the mystical experience. The end of the object of this, quote, inward alchemy will be the raising of the whole self to the condition in which conscious and permanent union with the Absolute takes place, and man, ascending to the summit of his manhood, enters into that greater life for which he was made. I invite you to just be present with the nature that's around us. I wish you could smell again the cold, feel the cold air and smell, and you can hear the crickets, I hope. Maybe one day this will be virtual reality and somehow you'll be able to enter in. In its journey towards this union, the subject passes through certain well-marked phases, which constitute what is known as the, quote, mystic way. This statement rules out from the true mystic kingdom all merely sentimental and affective piety and visionary poetry, no less than mystical philosophy. It brings us back to our first proposition, the concrete and practical nature of the mystical act. More than the apprehension of God, then, more than the passion for the absolute is needed to make a mystic. These must be combined with an appropriate psychological makeup, with a nature capable of extraordinary concentration and exalted moral emotion, a nervous organization of the artistic type. That's what they called it back in 1910. I don't know what the nervous organization means, but you need to be the artistic type. All these are necessary to the successful development of the mystic life process. But we all were created by an artist. That's divine love. So even if you don't feel like you're artistic, you are. It's just learning how to surrender into that. Now, I'm a psychologist for the last 20 plus years. I didn't say that at the beginning of this video, I don't think. But so sometimes I'm going to be putting stuff in, but mostly I'll just be reading. But if it can help illuminate this, then I'll do my best. If not, I want her to just keep reading because I just trust that she'll answer it in the process. All these are necessary to the successful development of the mystic life process. In the experience of the mystics who have left us, the records of their own lives, the successive stages of this life process are always traceable. Oh, it's just like Tony Robbins says, success leaves clues. Lots of people say that. Oh, there's a baby. Okay, anyway. In the second part of this book, they will be found worked out at some length. Rolle, Suso, Madame Guyon, Saint Teresa, and many others have left us valuable self-analysis for comparison, and from them we see how arduous, how definite, and how far removed from mere emotional or intellectual activity is that educational discipline by which the eye which looks upon eternity is able to come to its own. One of the marks of the true mystic, says Leuba, Leuba, is the tenacious and heroic energy with which he pursues a definite moral ideal. He is, says Pacheu, Pacheu, the pilgrim of an inward odyssey. Though we may be amazed and delighted by his adventures and discoveries on the way, to him the voyage and the end are all. The road on which we enter is a royal road which leads to heaven, says St. Teresa of Avila. It is strange that the conquest of such a treasure should cost us rather dear. No, sorry, it's a question. Is it strange? I was like, she wouldn't say that. Because I just finished reading her book yesterday, The Interior Castle. Not online, just to myself. I'm listening to it. Is it strange that the conquest of such a treasure should cost us rather dear? It's not strange, right? It is one of the many indirect testimonies to the objective reality of mysticism that the stages of this road, the psychology of the spiritual ascent, as described to us by different schools of contemplatives, always present, practically the same sequence of states. This, quote, school for saints has never found it necessary to bring its curriculum up to date. It's the same. Read St. John of the Cross, the ascent to Mount Carmel. It's the same as St. Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, as St. Catherine of Siena, all of these saints, all of the Philokalia says this. I know Callistus Ware. I met him and corresponded with him later. He just passed a few months ago. Translated the Philokalia of all the saints, like St. Gregory and all the desert saints. I don't know if there are desert fathers and mothers in there, but there are records of all those. Anyway, St. Ignatius of Loyola has the same story. The psychologist finds little difficulty, for instance, in reconciling the, quote, degrees of orison described by St. Teresa, recollection, quiet, union, ecstasy, rapt, the, quote, pain of God, and the spiritual marriage of the soul, with the 4 forms of contemplation enumerated by Hugh of St. Victor, or the Sufis' 7 stages of the soul's ascent to God, which begin in adoration and end in spiritual marriage. Though each wayfarer may choose different landmarks, it is clear from their comparison that the road is one. 5. As a corollary to these 4 rules, I think the 4 rules were in the last video. Yeah, they were. It just was. Don't worry, I won't go backwards. I'm just going to I see number 4 was mysticism entails a definite psychological experience. 3 is the business and methods of mysticism is love. I don't see 2, but 1. So she says, now how do these statements square with the practice of the great mystics and with the various forms of activity which have been classified at one time or another as mystical? 1, mysticism is practical, not theoretical. And then I read that in the last video. And 2, mysticism is an entirely spiritual activity. And so she's making the distinction between mysticism and magic and stuff like that. 3, the business and method of mysticism is love. And then 4, and then now we're reading 5. As a corollary to these 4 rules, it is perhaps well to reiterate the statement already made that, quote, that true mysticism is never self-seeking. It is not, as many think, the pursuit of supernatural joys, the satisfaction of a high ambition. Good luck staying on the mystic path if that's... It'll weed you out right there, right? The mystic does not enter on his or her quest because he or she desires the happiness of the beatific vision, the ecstasy of union with the absolute, or any other personal reward. In, quote, that strange, extravagant, and heroic character which calls itself a Christian mystic, that noblest of all passions, the passions for perfection, for love's sake, far outweighs the desire for transcendental satisfaction. Hello. O love, said Saint Catherine of Genoa, I do not wish to follow thee for sake of these delights, but solely from the motive of true love. End quote. Those who do otherwise are only, in the plain words of St. John of the Cross, quote, spiritual gluttons. There's a thing called prelust that talks all about that. It's really, really worth reading about. It's in the Philokalia, but you can just look it up online. Maybe Pavel Florensky talks about it. Some of the Desert Fathers do. Someone brought it to my attention, and I appreciate it a long time ago. That's about spiritual gluttony. Or, in the milder metaphor here adopted, magicians of the more high-minded sort. The true mystic claims no promises and makes no demands. That's in a song. No promises, no demands. Love is a battlefield. Anyway. It might be important later on in this video. The true mystic claims no promises and makes no demands. He goes because he must, as Galahad went towards the Grail, the Holy Grail, knowing that for those who can live it, this alone is life. He never rests in that search for God, which he holds to be the fulfillment of his highest duty, yet he seeks without any certainty of success. It's true. He holds with Saint Bernard that, quote, he alone is God, who can never be sought in vain, not even when he cannot be found. I heard someone say it this way. They said, every time I surrendered. Oh, Joe Dispenza said this. I'm translating what he said, but he said every time he surrendered to that which is unknown, to God, to that which is higher, the God, he's never been disappointed. We've never been let down, but it always feels like. Anyway, with Matilda of Magdeburg, he hears the Absolute saying in his soul, she's a she, but I don't know what, St. Bernard. O soul, before the world was, I longed for thee, and I still long for thee, and thou for me. Therefore, when our two desires unite, love shall be fulfilled. Like his type, the, quote, devout lover, end quote, of romance, then the mystic serves without hope of reward. By one of the many paradoxes of the spiritual life, he obtains satisfaction because he does not seek it, completes his personality because he gives it up. Attainment, says Dionysius the Areopagite, in words which are writ large on the annals of Christian ecstasy, quote, comes only by means of the sincere, spontaneous, and entire surrender of yourself and all things. End quote. Oh wait, I think that's it. Anyway. Only with the annihilation of selfhood comes the fulfillment of love. Were the mystic asked the cause of his often extraordinary behavior, his austere and steadfast quest, it is unlikely that his reply would contain any reference to the sublime illumination of unspeakable delights. It is more probable that he would answer in some such words as those of Jacob Boehme, quote, I am not come to this meaning or to this work and knowledge through my own reason or through my own will and purpose, neither have I sought this knowledge, nor so much as to know anything concerning it. I sought only for the heart of God, therein to hide myself. It has been well said that such a search is not the quest of joy, but the satisfaction of a craving impelled by the spur of necessity. This craving is the craving of the soul, unable to rest in those symbols of the sensual world, which only feed the little tract of normal consciousness. To attain that fullness of life for which she was made, to, quote, lose herself in that which can be neither seen nor touched, giving herself entirely to this sovereign object, without belonging to either herself or to others, united to the unknown by the most noble part of herself, and because of her renouncement of knowledge, finally drawing from this absolute ignorance a knowledge which the understanding knows not how to attain. Mysticism, then, is seen as the, quote, one way out for the awakened spirit of man. It is the healing of that human incompleteness which is the origin of our divine unrest, the inevitable reaction of the fully conscious, fully living soul upon, quote, eternal truth, true love, and loved eternity. I am sure, says Meister Eckhart, right, that if a soul knew the very least of all that being means, being with a capital B, it would never turn away from it, end quote. The mystics have never turned away to do what would have seemed to them a self-destructive act. Here, in this world of illusion, they say, we have no continuing city. This statement to you, a proposition, is to us the central fact of life. Quote, therefore, it is necessary to hasten our departure from hence, and to be indignant that we are bound in one part of our nature in order that with the whole of ourselves we may fold ourselves about divinity and have no part void of contact with him. To sum up, mysticism is seen to be a highly specialized form of that search for reality, for heightened and completed life, which we have found to be a constant characteristic of the human consciousness. It is largely prosecuted by that, quote, spiritual spark, that transcendental faculty which, though the life of our life remains below the threshold of ordinary man, emerging from its hiddenness is in the mystic, it gradually becomes the dominant factor in his life, subduing to its service and enhancing by its saving contact with reality those vital powers of love and will which we attribute to the heart, rather than those of mere reason and perception, which we attribute to the head. So she's saying that, I'll translate a little bit so you can get it. If you don't, if you do, then that's great. You can write comments for people to understand more. Is she saying that because we know as mystics that this isn't our real city is in heaven, and we're just visitors here, and we're meant to come here for a purpose, God knows what, and reveals it. But the mystic, as you keep going on this mystic adventure, you as your eyes are unveiled to see these higher truths, it almost makes life bearable. Because you see poetry in everything, you see beauty in everything. I was quoting today in a video I made Dostoevsky, who said in the end, the world will be saved by beauty. This is so true at the deepest level. It resonates, and as a mystic you can know this because this call keeps calling you onward, no matter how difficult the road gets, right? I'm gonna get my flashlight so I can read. I might move in a little bit. So enjoy the view while it's there. Under the spur of this love and will, the whole personality rises in the acts of contemplation and ecstasy to a level of consciousness at which it becomes aware of a new field of perception. By this awareness, by this, quote, loving sight, it is stimulated to a new life in accordance with the reality which it has beheld. So strange and exalted is this life that it never fails to provoke either the anger or the admiration of other men. If the great Christian mystics, said Liuba, could by some miracle be all brought together in the same place, each in his habitual environment, there to live according to his manner, the world would soon perceive that they constitute one of the most amazing and profound variations of which the human race has yet been witness. End quote. A discussion of mysticism as a whole will therefore include two branches. First, the life process of the mystic, the remaking of his personality or her personality, the method by which his peculiar consciousness of the absolute is attained, the faculties which have been evolved to meet the requirements of the phenomenal are enabled to do work on the transcendental plane, and faculties which have been evolved. Your faculties, your level of consciousness changes, your level of consciousness expands. It's like you expand, you become something of like, Teresa of Avila was describing a little butterfly, from a caterpillar to a butterfly, so that you can perceive these mystical things, you know? So she says, which have been evolved to meet the requirements of the phenomenal, are enabled to do work on the transcendental plane. Sometimes I call that the 5D, but it doesn't mean go seek after the occult or magic. It doesn't mean that. This is the mystic way in which the self passes through the states or stages of development, which were codified by the Platonists, and after them by the medieval mystics as purgation, illumination, and ecstasy. Secondly, the content of the mystical field of perception, the revelation under which the contemplative becomes aware of the absolute. This will include a consideration of the so-called doctrines of mysticism, the attempts of the articulate mystic to sketch for us the world into which he has looked in language which is only adequate to the world in which the rest of us dwell. Here the difficult question of symbolism and of symbolic theology comes in, a point upon which many promising expositions of the mystic have been wrecked. It will be our business to strip off, as far as may be, the symbolic wrapping and attempt a synthesis of these doctrines to resolve the apparent contradictions of objective and subjective revelations, of the ways of negation and affirmation, emanation and immanence with the IMMANENCE, surrender and deification, the divine dark and the inward light, and finally to exhibit, if we can, the essential unity of that experience in which the human soul enters consciously into the presence of God. All right, I am going to walk down the mountain and complete this. So don't go anywhere. I'll just put these together. That's a lot of work for me, so stick around, right? It's worth it. Be right back. All right, I got creative. I'm sitting on the back of one of my chairs, up top of it. And this is a map of Paris. So I just thought, you know, if you want something to stare at while we're reading, because sometimes, most of the time, my head is down, I like having something. Because we don't have the changing outside. All right, this is chapter 5, Mysticism and Theology. So we'll go another 30 minutes. If you want to look at that for a second or get a screenshot. I read the beginning here so that we get it. Okay, mystic diagrams, theology as used by the mystics, their conception of God, emanatio and eminence. Emanatio and eminence. Emanation discussed. Dante, the Kabbalists. Oh, good. I want to see what she has to say in 1910. She says we don't need to go into Kabbalism. But anyway. Aquinas, its psychological aspect, eminence with an IMMANENCE, discussed. The other one was the same anyway. The basis of introversion, the ground of soul and universe, emanation and eminence compared, both accepted by the mystics. Objections to this answered. Emanation and the mystic way, its reconciliation with eminence, Both describe experience, are expressions of temperament. Mystical theology must include both. Theology is the mystic's map, sometimes but not always adequate. Christianity, the best of such maps. It combines the metaphysical and personal aspects of the divine, reconciles emanation and immanence, emanation M-A-N, and immanence I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C-E, provides a congenial atmosphere for the mystic, explains his adventures, all Western mystics implicitly Christian. Interesting. That's really interesting. Blake, the dogma of the Trinity, division of persons essential to the description of God, the indwelling and transcendent aspects of the divine, St. Teresa, her vision of the Trinity, Father, Word, Holy Spirit, threefold division of reality, Neoplatonic Trinities, Lady Julian of Norwich, on the Trinity, its psychological justification, goodness, truth, and beauty, Trinitarian doctrine and the mystics, light, life, love, the incarnation, its mystical aspect, the repairer, the drama of faith, the eternal birth of the Son, the new birth in man, regeneration, and conclusion. Wow, I wish we could get through all of this tonight, right? In the last chapter, we tried to establish a distinction between the mystic who tastes supreme experience and the mystical philosopher who cogitates upon the data so obtained. We have now, however, to take account of the fact that the true mystic is also very often a mystical philosopher, though there are plenty of mystical philosophers who are not and could never be mystics. Because it is characteristic of the human self to reflect upon its experience, to use its percepts as material for the construction of a concept, most mystics have made or accepted a theory of their own adventures. Thus, we have a mystical philosophy or theology, the comment of the intellect on the proceedings of spiritual intuition, running side by side with the true or empirical mysticism, classifying its data, criticizing it, explaining it, and translating its vision of the supersensible into symbols which are amenable to dialectic, yeah, amenable. I keep doing this so that there's a clear. Anyway, such a philosophy is most usually founded upon the formal creed which the individual mystic accepts. It is characteristic of him that in so far as his transcendental activities are healthy, he is generally an acceptor and not a rejecter of such creeds. The view which regards the mystic as a spiritual anarchist receives little support from history, which shows us over and over again the great mystics as faithful sons of the great religions. I think she means sons and daughters. I'm sure she does, because she's going to talk about Teresa of Avila and Julian of Norwich. Almost any religious system which fosters unearthly love is potentially a nursery for mystics. And Christianity, Islam, Brahmanism, and Buddhism each receives its most sublime interpretations at their hands. Thus, St. Teresa interprets her ecstatic apprehension of the Godhead in strictly Catholic terms. Thus, Boheme believed to the last that his explorations of eternity were consistent with the teaching of the Lutheran Church. Thus, the Sufis were good Mohammedans. Philo and the Kabbalists were Orthodox Jews. Thus, Plotinus even adopted, though with what difficulty, the relics of paganism to his doctrine of the real. Wow. She has with what difficulty with an exclamation point. Attempts, however, to limit mystical truth, the direct apprehension of the divine substance, to the formula of any one religion are as futile as the attempt to identify a precious metal with the dye which converts it into current coin. The dyes which the mystics have used are many. Their peculiarities and excrescences, excrescences, are always interesting and sometimes highly significant. Some give a far sharper, more coherent impression than others, but the gold from which this diverse coinage is struck is always the same precious metal, always the same beatific vision of a goodness, truth, and beauty, which is one. Hence, its substance must always be distinguished from the accidents under which we perceive it, for this substance has a cosmic and not a denominational importance. That's such a great line. The substance of God we're talking about, right, has a cosmic and not a denominational importance. If, however, we are to understand the language of the mystics, it is evident that we must know a little of accident as well as of substance. That is to say, of the principal philosophies or religions which they have used in describing their adventures to the world. This being so, before we venture to apply ourselves to the exploration of theology proper, it will be well to consider the two extreme forms under which both mystics and theologians have been accustomed to conceive divine reality. That is to say, the so-called emanation theory, E-M-A-N-A-T-I-O-N, the emanation theory, and the eminence with an I theory of the transcendental world. Emanation with E and eminence are formidable words, which, though perpetually tossed to and fro by amateurs of religious philosophy, have probably, as they stand, little actuality for practical modern men. They are, however, root ideas for the maker of mystical diagrams, and his best systems are but attempts towards their reconciliation. Since the aim of every mystic is union with God, it is obvious that the vital question in his philosophy must be the place which this God, the Absolute, with union with God, is obvious that the vital question in his philosophy must be the place which this God, okay, so there's just a mark on the page, it's not a period, that's why. The Absolute of his quest occupies in the scheme. Briefly, he with a capital H, so we're talking about God here, has been conceived, or it were better to say presented by the great mystics under two apparently contradictory modes. One, the opinion which is represented in its most extreme form by the above-mentioned theory of emanations declares his utter transcendence. This view appears early in the history of Greek philosophy. It is developed by Dionysius, by the Kabbalists, by Dante, and it is implied in the language of Ruhlmann, R-U-L-M-A-N, Merswin, and many other Christian ecstatics. The solar system is an almost perfect symbol of this concept of the universe, which finds at once its most rigid and most beautiful expression in Dante's Paradiso. The absolute Godhead is conceived as removed by a vast distance from the material world of sense, the last or lowest of that system of dependent worlds or states which, generated by or emanating from the unity or central sun, becomes less in spirituality and splendor, greater in multiplicity, the further they recede from their source. That source, the great countenance of the Absolute, can never, say the Kabbalists, be discerned by man. It is the unplumbed abyss, or later mysticism. The cloud of unknowing wraps it from our sight. Only by its emanations or manifested attributes can we attain knowledge of it. And then there's some Latin in the footnotes. I was just checking if it was in our book again. By the outflow of these same manifested attributes and powers, the created universe exists, depending in the last resort on the latent dietas, who is therefore conceived as external to the world which he illuminates and vivifies. St. Thomas Aquinas virtually accepts the doctrine of emanations when he writes, quote, "As all the perfections of creatures descend in order from God, who is the height of perfection, man should begin from the lower creatures and ascend by degrees and so advance to the knowledge of God. And because in that roof and crown of all things, God, we find the most perfect unity, and everything is stronger and more excellent, the more thoroughly it is one. It follows that diversity and variety increase in things, the further they are removed from him, who is the first principle of all." End quote. Suso, whose mystical system, like that of most Dominicans, is entirely consistent with Thomist philosophy, is really glossing Aquinas when he writes, quote, the supreme and super essential spirit has ennobled man by illuminating him with a ray from the eternal Godhead. Hence, from out of the great ring, which represents the eternal Godhead, there flow forth little rings, which may be taken to signify the high nobility of natural creatures. I heard a mystic that I really like, a Christian mystic, describe it as God is like, beyond the sun, but like the sun rays through a window, and our life here is like that. We get our form from the form of the window, maybe if it's like an open window without even glass, and we are like a ray of that. So we're not calling ourselves God, but we are a ray of that. But if you wrap yourself up in darkness, there's this whole thing in Teresa of Avila that you don't even see. You don't even see the bright sun that's in the soul of you too. Anyway, obviously, if this theory of the absolute be accepted, the path of the soul's ascent to union with the divine must be literally a transcendence, a journey upward and outward through a long series of intermediate states or worlds till, having traversed the, quote, 32 paths of the tree of life, she at last arrives, in Kabbalistic language, at the crown, fruitive knowledge of God, the abyss or divine dark of the Dionysian school, the Neoplatonic one. Such a series of worlds. Hold on, I gotta stand up on this chair for a second. I'll sit down for a second so you guys can just watch the map. Okay. Such a series of worlds is symbolized by the 10 heavens of Dante, the hierarchies of Dionysus, the tree of life, or Sephiroth. It's called something else in other books, that's what I mean, of the Kabbalah, and receives its countersign in the inward experience, in the long journey of the self, through purgation and illumination to union. We ascend, says St. Augustine, thy ways that be in our heart, and sing a song of degrees. We glow inwardly with thy fire, with thy good fire, and we go, because we go upwards, to the peace of Jerusalem. I forget, Jerusalem, Salem means peace. I forget, it's like God's city or something, Jerusalem. I forgot, I wrote it down like last week again, but anyway. That's in Augustine's Confessions, book 13. Okay, this theory postulates under normal and non-mystical conditions the complete separation of the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal worlds. Hence the language of pilgrimage, of exile, of a world which has fallen from perfection into illusion and must make a long and painful return, comes naturally to the mystic, who apprehends reality under these terms. There's a really good book by Callistus Ware about what the Orthodox think call salvation. It's very small, but I've just read it maybe 3 weeks ago or so. And he talks about that the Orthodox don't. I won't get into it because I don't want there to be theological debates here. Let's just keep reading what she wrote, But there's just a lot more room for the symbolism to express itself. I'll just say it like that, right? Okay, it's just cutting off my blood to sit on the back of that chair, so I'm just going to sit down here for a little bit. But I like looking at you guys. Okay. To him, the mystical adventure is essentially a going forth from his normal self. Yeah, I'll go back to that. Conditions, okay. The temporal, okay. This theory postulates that under normal and non-mystical conditions, the complete separation of the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal worlds, hence the language of pilgrimage, of exile, of a world which has fallen from perfection into illusion and must make a long and painful return, comes naturally to the mystic who apprehends reality under these terms. To him, the mystical adventure is essentially a going forth from his normal self and from his normal universe. Like the psalmist, in his heart he hath, quote, in his heart he hath disposed to ascend by steps in this vale of tears, end quote. From the less to the more divine, he, and with him the cosmos, for we must never forget that to mystical philosophy, the soul of the individual subject is the microcosm of the soul of the world, has got to retrace the long road to the perfection from which it originally came forth. As the fish in Rulman Merswin's vision of the 9 rocks must struggle upwards from pool to pool until they reach their origin. Such a way of conceiving reality accords with the type of mind which William James has denominated the sick soul. It is the mood of the contrite, of the penitent, of the utter humility which, appalled by the sharp contrast between itself and the perfect which it contemplates, can only cry, quote, out of the depths. It comes naturally to the kind of temperament which leans to pessimism, which sees a great gulf fixed between itself and its desire, and is above all things sensitive to the elements of evil and imperfection in its own character and in the normal experience of man. Permitting these elements to dominate its field of consciousness, wholly ignoring the divine aspect of the world of becoming, such a temperament constructs from its perceptions and prejudices the concept of a material world and a normal self which is very far from God. Okay, so that's one theology. I'm going to lower you guys. All right. I'm going to drink a water. Okay. Wow. And if you read George MacDonald, who C.S. Lewis said every book he ever wrote was inspired either directly or indirectly by George MacDonald. That's why, I mean, I just love George MacDonald, but lots of people said that he was more like a universalist, and so he was criticized for that. Anyway, that's just how you see it. You see it when you look at one of these people, but it doesn't mean that that's what they are. There are a lot of paradoxes in the spiritual path. It's this and that. It's narrow and wide, you know. I mean, Jesus said it's narrow, so I would take to that. But he also said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, you know. And so it's like the whole world can be included on this narrow path. That's one of the paradoxes. I've talked about that some in the other chapters. All right. Okay, number 2, immanence. At the opposite pole from this way of sketching reality is the extreme theory of immanence, so fashionable amongst liberal theologians at the present time. To the holders of this theory, who belong of necessity to Professor James, quote, James's healthy-minded or optimistic class, the quest of the absolute is no long journey, but a realization of something which is implicit in the self and in the universe, an opening of the eyes of the soul upon the reality with a capital R, right? In which it is bathed, right? Rumi says this, he says we're like fish in the ocean, looking for water, and we're living in it, right? We're living in God right now. And in a way we are. The Native Americans, I'm part Native American, they say, Mitakia Washan, you're in the mind womb of God right now. And even Teresa of Avila, I was reading it. It's in like one of the last 2 chapters of Interior Castle. I was reading it last night. She said, if people only knew that they were doing all these evil, wicked things within God, you're in God while you're doing these things. You're not getting away with anything. They're not done in isolation. You're in God doing it. It's kind of like, I heard a Native American, someone describe how a Native American described it to him, said it's like if a bunny rabbit crawled across your leg, you would know, God knows everything that's happening within God. It's like we're made out of God, but we're also in God. And the world is in us, but we're also in the world. It's when you've had mystic experiences, you can see how it can be both. But if you haven't, then sometimes this just sounds like words. But don't worry about it. You'll have some kind of experience that will show you this, Something, like even a ride at Disneyland or something, a ride at an amusement park. You can get that feeling when you're at the top and you see the whole park, and you didn't see it before when you were running on the ground. You just had the map. Seeing it from up above in 3D reality versus seeing it on the map and you keep trying to get to these places is a different experience, but both are true, are they not? Right? So these liberal, healthy-minded, they call them healthy, William James, I think, calls healthy-minded or optimistic class, the quest of the absolute is no long journey, but a realization of something which is implicit in the self and in the universe, an opening of the eyes of the soul upon the reality in which it is bathed. For them, earth is literally, quote, crammed with heaven. Here's a quote, right? It says, "Thou wert I, but dark was my heart. I knew not the secret transcendent," says, I do not know how to, okay, Tewekkul, Tewekkul Beg, a Muslim mystic of the 17th century. This is always the cry of the temperament, which leans to a theology of eminence, once its eyes are opened on the light. God, says Plotinus, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing any of these wrong. We get what we get. We don't throw a fit, right? Is not external to anyone. I'm like, I haven't seen any of you guys make this. This is where I was like, I have free reign to just do this, because if someone else had put in the effort to read this out loud for us, but maybe it's out there and I just didn't get it. So this is what we got so far, right? God, says Plotinus, is not external to anyone, but is present with all things, though they are ignorant that he is so. In other and older worlds, quote, the Spirit of God is within you. I don't know maybe that's from the Bible. The Absolute, whom all seek, does not hold himself aloof from an imperfect material universe, but dwells within the flux of things, stands, as it were, at the very threshold of consciousness, and knocks, awaiting the self's slow discovery of her treasures. Quote, he is not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, is the pure doctrine of immanence, a doctrine whose teachers are drawn from amongst the souls which react more easily to the touch of the divine than to the sense of alienation and of sin, and are naturally inclined to love rather than to awe. The truth that, quote, God and man initially meet where man is most inward, end quote, in the spark or ground of the soul, is the cardinal fact in their experience of the transcendental world. Let me just see, that was 3. That was from a guy named Gibson. and Rudolf Euclid's philosophy, the Aeneid before that. But she spells it weird, E-N-N-E-A-D, so I'm not sure of that one. And then the Muslim was quoted by W.L. Lilly in many mansions. And I think the other ones are just scriptures, because I've heard them before. I'm just in a different mind when I'm reading, so sometimes I don't know. Unless safeguarded by limiting dogmas, in him we move and have our being. I know that's in the New Testament as well, but anyway, unless, and John says in the book of Revelation, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any of you would open it, you can let me in. And Jesus says, when you pray, you ought to go into your inner room and shut all the doors. And I wear this ring, to symbolize that, for me to remember. Go in to my innermost, right? And shut all the doors of my outer senses. Be quiet in my heart. Be still. Anyway, unless safeguarded by limiting dogmas, the theory of immanence taken alone is notoriously apt to degenerate into pantheism and into those extravagant perversions of the doctrine of deification in which the mystic holds his transfigured self to be identical with the indwelling God. It's like a drop of the ocean is not the whole of the ocean itself, or the source of the ocean, right? But when you are a drop of the ocean, you put back in the ocean, you feel like you're vibrating godness, but you are not God. So it's easy for people to think that, oh, this totem pole is God, or the sun is God, or this animal is God, and whatever else they attribute to that. But it doesn't. Anyway, you can learn this. Okay, so the doctrine of deification in which the mystic holds his transfigured self to be identical with the indwelling God. It is the philosophical basis of that practice of introversion, the turning inwards of the soul's faculties in contemplation, which has been the method of the great practical mystics of all creeds. So we do turn in, but anyway, that God, since he is in all, in a sense is all, may most easily be found within ourselves, is the doctrine of these adventurers, who, denying or ignoring the existence of those intervening worlds or planes between the material world and the absolute, which are postulated by the theory of emanations, claim with Roysbrook that, quote, by a simple introspection in a fruitive love, they, quote, meet God without intermediary. They hear the Father of Lights saying eternally without intermediary or interruption in the most secret part of the spirit, the one unique and abysmal word with a capital W, the one unique and abysmal word, end quote. This divine essence or substance, which the introversive mystic finds dwelling, as Roysbrook says, at the apex of man's spirit, is the, quote, spark of the soul of Meister Eckhart, the, quote, ground of Tauler, the inward light of the Quakers, the divine principle of some modern transcendentalists, the fount and source of all true life. At this point, words and definitions fail mystic and theologian alike. A tangle of metaphors takes their place. He is face to face with the wonder of wonders, that most real of all experiences, the union of human and divine, and a nameless something, which is great enough to be God, small enough to be me. Hence, at one moment, the spark of the soul is presented to us as the divine to which the self attains, at another, as that transcendental aspect of the self which is in contact with God. On either hypothesis, it is that in which the mystic encounters absolute being and constitutes his guarantee of God's immediate presence in the human heart, and if in the human heart, then in that universe of which man's soul resumes, in miniature, the essential characteristics. According to the doctrine of immanence, creation, the universe, could we see it as it is, if we could see it as it is, would be perceived as the self-development, the self-unfolding of this indwelling deity. The world is not projected from the absolute, but rather enshrines it. I understood, says St. Teresa, quote, how our Lord was in all things and how he was in the soul, and the illustration of a sponge filled with the water was suggested to me, end quote. The world process, then, is the slow coming to fruition of that divine spark, which is latent alike in the cosmos and in man. If, says Boehm, quote, thou conceivest a small, minute circle, as small as a grain of mustard seed, yet the heart of God is wholly and perfectly therein. And if thou art born in God, then there is in thyself, in the circle of thyself, the whole heart of God undivided, end quote. The idea of immanence has seldom been more beautifully expressed. Well, that was good. I'm going to read that part again and then we'll close with that. If, says Boehm, thou conceivest a small, minute circle, as small as a grain of mustard seed, and yet the heart of God is wholly and perfectly therein, and if thou art born in God, then there is in thyself, in the circle of thy life, the whole heart of God undivided. The idea of immanence has seldom been more beautifully expressed. All right. She talks more about Meister Eckhart. Well, I can't wait to read more of this, but I'm going to wait for the next time. I'd appreciate it. Feel free to share this with other people who would like to listen about this book or understand about mysticism. That grows my channel, because this shrinks my channel right now. Because a lot of people, well, you know, some people just want the other videos that I make, but I'm not going to make a separate channel so far for these kinds of things. And so it confuses the algorithms. So I'd love it if you watch these to the end and share them, just so that more people get it. I don't know what else for, because I haven't figured that out yet. All right, I wish you so much love. Thanks for being here. Much love.